Hi, and welcome to the Water Pollution Lab. My name is Dr. Bob Remedi, and I am going to, in this video, walk you through a little bit of information that you need to know to complete the Water Pollution Lab in a remote setting. So the purpose of this lab is to essentially give us an opportunity to simulate dumping a variety of different pollutants into a wetland habitat and seeing what its effects are. But before we can get to the lab, we have to know some basic information first. So, why do we need water? Water is pretty important stuff. In fact, if we look at the oldest fossils that are found on Earth, about 3.5 billion years or so old, they are stromatolites, which are the structures that are formed from these ancient photosynthetic bacteria. Looking at living things that are alive today, like ourselves. Human body is made up of anywhere from 55 to 60% water. And even though we are terrestrial organisms, we walk on land, we carry our ocean with us. So our cells are filled up with water so that we can take the water that we need with us as we go. We also need water for things like cooking and cleaning. Water is important for transportation. Here we see a windsurfer on Lake Geneva. We use water for recreation, as the people that were fishing near McHenry Dam on the Fox River saw. Water is used for habitat for a variety of organisms, and humans also use water to produce electricity in generating hydroelectric power. So water is pretty important stuff. Now, water is made from the combination of one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms that are bound together, like you can see over here. Hey, now we could go into a lot of depth on the physical properties of water. We're going to talk just a couple of them. So, as I'm sure you are aware, water ice is the solid form of water that forms when water gets below 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Water is a liquid above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And the heat, the temperature in the water actually causes those water molecules to bump into one another more. So the warmer the water is, the more those molecules are going to be bumping into one another. And that will actually be important to us when we talk about the relationship between water and temperature in a little while. So water is also very important because a lot of things dissolve in it. And in terms of living things, water is sometimes called the universal solvent because so many of the chemicals that are important for living things are actually dissolved in the water in our cells and in our body. So to define water pollution represents the chemical, physical, or biological change to make water unsuitable for use by humans. And we've got a number of different types of water pollution. First of which is called inorganic water pollution. And inorganic just means it contains chemicals that are not based on carbon. But this can include a whole variety of different things, including heavy metals, chemical solvents, acids, salts, etc. So there's lots of different things that would be considered inorganic pollutants. Now we measure inorganic pollutants, and frankly we measure lots of different things in parts per million. So imagine I had a jar and it contained 1,000,000 molecules. Okay? Of that 1,000,000 molecules, if 10 of them were oxygen, we would say we have 10 parts per million of oxygen. Okay? So it's just a way of measuring the number of atoms or molecules that we have. Another type of pollution would be sewage or nutrient pollution. Sewage, it's pretty obvious. Nutrient pollution is grouped with this because it also contains the elements nitrogen and phosphorus, as does sewage. And nitrogen and phosphorus are what we call limiting factors. So these are important elements that are necessary for living things to grow. And they're often found in quantities that are low enough that it prevents a lot of organisms from growing. So as we see, if we're going to be dumping nutrients or dumping sewage into a body of water, there's going to be lots of these limiting factors, so we're going to see species being able to grow and grow and grow really fast. In addition, when we're talking about sewage pollution, sewage can also contain lots of harmful bacteria. We have thermal pollution, thermal referring to heat. And if you look at power plants take water, heat it to steam, and use that steam to turn a turbine and generate electricity. But that hot water, the steam, then has to go someplace. And if it goes into a body of water and it raises the temperature, that's thermal pollution. And that's dangerous because if you raise the temperature of water too high, that water doesn't hold an awful lot of oxygen. And remember that because we'll be talking about that later. And then we also have silt. And silt represents the little particles of soil that get washed into water. And if we have lots of those particles in the water becomes cloudy, which makes it undesirable and also can make it difficult for living things that are growing in the water to do things like photosynthesis. So we can break down the different types of pollution into point source and non-point source pollution. So point source pollution means the pollution is coming from one point. In this case, we would be able to trace the pollution back to a single factory or a particular waste treatment facility that is not treating their sewage properly and just dumping it into a water. So point source pollution comes from one point. Non-point source pollution is where we have pollution that's being generated generally at relatively low levels, but from lots of different places. So lots of different places are dumping low amounts of nutrients into the water. So we wouldn't necessarily be able to trace the pollution back to a single point. But the effects can be the same. If we're getting lots of pollutants dumped at low levels from lots of places, it can still be pretty damaging to the habitat. And good examples of this would include fertilizer. So if we're looking at a subdivision and everybody's fertilizing their lawn with lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, that can wash into a stream, which can wash into a pond or a lake and cause some serious problems. So here's some examples of non-point source pollution. On the left, you see the combine here harvesting corn, but as it's going along its business, doing what it needs to do, it's sending up a lot of dirt and dust, which can become silt if it goes into a wetland. Here we see a housing development where they have essentially plowed down all the plants in preparation for building houses. This also can lead to silt being dumped into wetlands from lots of different places. Another good example. So here is a satellite image I took from NASA that's showing Lake Michigan. And as you can see, there's lots of green areas around Lake Michigan here. And that represents natural areas and urban areas where they have lawns that are dumping their nutrients into the lake. And in fact, you can see these big swirls of algae from outer space in this picture. Pretty cool picture there. Now here's an example of point source pollution. So as you're walking along, there's this pretty nasty looking stuff coming out of that drain, right? If we were to go and travel up that pipe to find out where that pollution is coming from, we would be able to find the place where that pollution was produced. So that represents point source pollution there. All right, as I mentioned before, oxygen is pretty important to have in the water. So most living things, with the exception of some bacteria and some archaeans, most living things are going to need oxygen. And that's going to include organisms that live in the water. Now, without getting too deep into the biology of this, oxygen is important because it's needed for the process of taking sugar, like glucose, and breaking it down to make another chemical called ATP. And ATP is the molecule that's directly used for energy by the cells. Cells gotta have it. Okay, so oxygen is necessary for this process of making ATP so that the cells can live. If the oxygen levels in the water drop too low, those organisms that live in the water can die. So here we see a goldfish swimming around in a wine glass here. What would happen if we were to cover up the top of the glass, put some saran wrap over the top? Well, pretty quickly, the fish, which takes in oxygen through its gills, here you can see the operculum or the gill cover here, As the fish is swimming around, it would be taking in oxygen into the gills. If we covered up the wine glass, more oxygen wouldn't be able to get into the glass here, and as a result, the fish would suffocate and die pretty quickly. This is important to know as we talk about eutrophication. So eutrophication is going to occur when we add nitrogen and phosphorus, those limiting factors, to the water. Okay, that's going to cause algae and photosynthetic bacteria levels in the water to explode. And in fact, those photosynthesizers can actually grow so thick they can act like saran wrap covering up the top of our wine glass. So that algae and the bacteria can grow so thick they will prevent oxygen from going into the water with the same effect that the fish would die. And as things in the water are going to die, that's going to cause decomposer levels in the water to explode. And they're going to pull what little oxygen is left out of the water, making the amount of oxygen go even lower still. So this process is called eutrophication. And here you see a picture of a pond I took. This is actually on what is now the South Lake campus of CLC before they did some expansion there. And here is a pond. I'm going to show you. Here's a dragonfly for scale here. So we're looking down in the water, and there's algae and aquatic plants growing so thick you can't see any open water. Okay, and that's going to prevent oxygen from getting into the water, and thus making it difficult for organisms that live in the water to survive. So if we wanted to measure the amount of oxygen in the water, and we can do that. In fact, there's a lab, the water chemistry lab, where we measure the amount of oxygen in the water. We say the amount of oxygen in the water is called DO, or dissolved oxygen. Now, related to this is something we call biological oxygen demand, which is the demand for or the need of organisms that live in the water for that oxygen to survive. Now, the more organisms that we have in the water, the greater the BOD, right? More organisms need more oxygen. So they're going to be taking the oxygen out of the water to survive. And as they do that, if we have lots of organisms taking oxygen out of the water, the DO, or dissolved oxygen, levels plummet. So in the case of a eutrophic lake, where we have lots of nutrients being dumped into the water, a lot of organisms are going to be growing in there. They're going to be pulling the oxygen out of the water. As the biological oxygen demand with all those organisms there goes up, the actual amount of oxygen, the dissolved oxygen, goes down. So that low dissolved oxygen level is because of the high number of organisms there that are taking the oxygen out of the water. So when we talk about biological oxygen demand, or BOD, and dissolved oxygen, DO, we like to think of them generally working as inverses. So as BOD goes down, as our number of organisms goes down, there's less demand for the oxygen, so dissolved oxygen levels go up. Conversely, as biological oxygen demand goes up as more organisms are growing, the DO, or dissolved oxygen, levels go down. And there's a neat little graphic there to hopefully help you remember that. So when we talk about biological oxygen demand and dissolved oxygen, usually they are inversely proportional. So as BOD goes up, DO goes down. As BOD goes down, DO goes up. Now, how do we know if there's nutrient pollution in a body of water? Well, certainly the easiest way to do this is by measuring the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus, which we talked about in the water chemistry lab. You can measure dissolved oxygen levels, and if the dissolved oxygen levels are low, that's a pretty good sign that there's a lot of nutrients in the water and the BOD is going to go up. We can also do things like counting the amount of aquatic invertebrates in the water. So in general, if we have only a few invertebrates living in the water, that's probably a sign that there's nutrient pollution or eutrophication taking place. Or if we find some species of invertebrates that tend to tolerate low oxygen levels, like these little critters called bloodworms. If we're going out and we only find bloodworms in the water, and they're called bloodworms because they have this red hemoglobin-like molecule which allows them to bind the oxygen and thus survive in those low oxygen levels. If the only inverts we find are critters like these bloodworms, that's also a sign that we've got eutrophication, this nutrient pollution going on. And there you see a dragonfly larva which happens to not be able to tolerate low oxygen levels. So finding dragonfly larvae like this in good numbers tells us that we probably don't have too terribly much nutrient pollution going on. These are cool critters. All right, we're almost done with the background information that we need for the lab, but I want to talk about one more quick thing, and that's wastewater treatment. So there's 2 or 3 steps in wastewater treatment. The first of which is called primary treatment. And this is where you use ponds or large tanks to take the sewage in and allow the big chunky stuff to settle, if you know what I'm talking about there. Okay, and after the water has had a chance to settle, gravity is pulling the water through. It could be a series of pipes, it could be a series of gravel and different types of stones. The material that you have left over is going to be composted, and it's going to contain, fecal material and toilet paper and stuff like this. Interesting side note, if you go to any of the home improvement stores, you can buy great big bags of stuff called Milorganite. Milorganite is the composted stuff left over from the Milwaukee wastewater treatment. So you would be buying the composted stuff left over from primary treatment in Milwaukee, and you're paying for the opportunity to do that, but don't feel bad because I pay for it too. The rest of the stuff that would be not organic, so when people improperly flush plastics and other non-compostable stuff, that then has to be removed and sent to the landfill. But what you have left after primary treatment is pretty much all liquid. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it's liquid that you want to be drinking. So we need to take it and go to secondary treatment then. And in secondary treatment, they're going to use bacteria and fungi to break down all that stuff that's dissolved in the water. Okay, now remember, we're going to be using bacteria and fungi, so there's going to be lots of these organisms in the water. There's going to be high biological oxygen demand, so they'll be pumping oxygen into this water to allow these microorganisms to break down all that stuff that we don't want in the water. Now what you get out of this is then water with most of the nasty stuff broken down, but it's still going to have a lot of those microorganisms. So you want to treat the water before you consume it. So you do things like treat it with chlorine, you can use ozone gas, you can use UV light, and this is going to kill any of those remaining microorganisms in the water. The water at the end of secondary treatment is safe to drink, but it may have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And remember, we want to be careful dumping that nitrogen and phosphorus into bodies of water because that can cause nutrient pollution. So many municipalities will then use what we call tertiary treatment. And in tertiary treatment, they could treat this water chemically to remove the nitrogen and the phosphorus. But in many cases, they will take and pump that water into a wetland. And in the wetland, autotrophs like algae, aquatic plants, there's these teeny tiny little plants called duckweed, which are commonly used. And these autotrophs are going to take the nitrogen and phosphorus and they're going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And as they grow, they are thus taking the nitrogen and the phosphorus out of the water. And when you do that, you can actually collect the duckweed, compost it, and thus be removing the nitrogen and phosphorus from the water. So as the plants and the algae are going to use the nitrogen and the phosphorus, the concentration of these elements is going to go down, and you end up with a nice wetland, which you can see here with common gallinule kind of swimming around in it. Pretty cool bird. So all of this background is meant to help prepare you for the lab that you're to be working on this week. So in the lab, we would be manipulating a variety of different conditions to see its effects on pollution and living things in a particular body of water. Okay, so we want to see how manipulating these different conditions would affect the environment without actually having to dump this stuff into a wetland and cause bad things to happen. So the conditions that we will be looking at in the lab include things like what type of wetland is it? Is it a fast-flowing river? Is it a slow-flowing river? Is it a pond, etc.? What type of waste is going to be dumped? Is it organic waste like sewage? Is it inorganic waste, industrial waste from a factory? What is the temperature of the water? Because that can influence the amount of oxygen in the water. How much pollution is being dumped. If you're dumping just a little bit, that can have a big difference from dumping a lot of pollution. What type of waste treatment, if any, is going on. And each different part of the lab. So as you're reading through the lab, you'll see there's different parts, each of which is manipulating different conditions. Okay, and in order to understand what's going on for each of these, you need to read the lab. Please read the lab before really looking at the results. So the computer would be simulating the effects of given conditions on a particular body of water, and it would again allow you to see the effects on the concentration of the pollutant, or what they call the waste, as well as on oxygen levels. And you will use the results in the PDF document that's associated with this lab in order to answer the questions associated with the lab. The results you will find in a PDF document titled Water Pollution Lab Supplement. And for my classes, you will find this in Canvas. If you have a different instructor, your instructor will tell you how to get this document. So if we were in class running this lab in our computer lab, and you typed in all the appropriate conditions, you would see a page that looked kind of like this. I want to break this down for you so you don't get lost and so you can understand what we're manipulating here. So if you look at the yellow oval there, here it says the body of water. So what type of body of water? Is it a pond? Is it a lake? Now notice slow river is in red here, so this particular simulation is looking at the effects of a slow moving river. You could also have a fast river. Below that, there's the temperature of the water. The type of waste, is it industrial waste or is it organic waste like sewage? What is the rate of waste being dumped into the water? What type of treatment? Is there no treatment? Is there primary treatment? Is there secondary treatment? And then below that, the number of days. Notice on the table over here, we also see the days over here, 1 through 10, 11 through 20, and 21 through 30. And here's an arrow pointing to days 1 through 10. We also see the amount of oxygen for days 1 through 10 here. And notice these are in parts per million, although we also see oxygen here and oxygen here for days 11 through 20 and day 21 through 30. And we are also looking at waste measured in parts per million. Okay, now when we're looking at the amount of oxygen and the amount of waste, we see a bunch of numbers here. So when we're looking at oxygen, if the numbers are in green, then we're talking about oxygen parts per million oxygen concentrations are at 5 parts per million or greater. If we're looking at oxygen and the numbers are in red, that means oxygen levels are below 5 parts per million. And in this simulation, 5 parts per million is the number that we use to represent fish kill. So less than 5 parts per million of oxygen means most fish aren't going to be able to survive in those conditions. Higher than 5 parts per million of oxygen means that most fish would be able to survive. Okay, so as you go through the lab, You'll see a different one of these graphics for each of the different parts. Make sure you read the data here and answer the questions that are associated with each one. Now, there's also a picture that looks like this. And this is a neat little graph that's looking at waste levels and oxygen levels. So the amount of waste is going to be plotted with this dark black line. So starting at day 1 right here, as we're dumping more waste into that slow moving river, the amount of waste is going to build up until we're at about 15, 16 parts per million of waste. Now, as that's happening, notice we've got this other graph over here, and these are oxygen levels. So our oxygen levels, the more waste there is, the more oxygen is going down, so that by the time we get to around day 14 or day 15, there's not enough oxygen left in the water. In fact, when we get to the fish kill is around day 6, between day 6 and day 7 there. So pretty dangerous stuff. So that's how you use this information in order to solve the water pollution lab. Thank you for your time. Good luck and keep up the good work.